Lately, Managing Director of SJ Solutions. Seema has been specialising in pharmacovigilance for 20 years and has headed up global pharmacovigilance and medical affairs before setting up SJ Solutions. SJ Solutions services span both consulting and contracting to provide solutions to drug safety, research and other affairs relating to the running of a business within the pharmaceuticals industry. She has helped companies in implementing the new EU legislation and is currently studying for her MSc in epidemiology. Seema, over to you.
Thank you very much. So welcome everybody. We're going to go through post-authorization safety studies. As you can see from the title, I've kind of focused on Module 8 because this does provide most of the relevant information that you do need for this area. So if we look at definition, so we know the definition does come from the directive, amended Directive 2001/83, Article 1, and definition here is any study relating to an authorized medicinal product and really related to identifying, characterizing, quantifying a safety hazard or confirming a safety profile of the product, or, importantly, a measure of the effectiveness of risk management measures. And certainly that seems to be where a lot of companies are having difficulty with regards to measuring effectiveness of risk management measures. I think when you've got additional risk management measures, that's probably a bit easier, but for routine, I think, and seeing how things really come together as far as a safety study, and is it a safety study or is it not, that does cause a lot of issues. So as we said, looking at what a post-authorization safety study should be about, it's about looking at quantifying potential identified risks, maybe to see if you can characterize the incident rate, the rate ratio. So really you're trying to get some further information with regards to safety information for your product. So there are different types of studies, or types, I'm saying different examples that are included here. So you could be looking at a risk in a specific patient population. So maybe this is missing information for your product. That could be use in pregnant women. It could be use in patients with hepatic impairment. It's stated that this is a missing information in a certain population, and you want to further evaluate the risks in that population. Long-term use, because often you won't have that from your clinical trial setting. You want to also look at the absence of risk. So you may want to follow a cohort of patients and have a look and see what isn't occurring as well, because you may be worried about something coming along and you want to make sure that that does not happen. Drug utilization, that's becoming more and more important, looking at how your product is actually used in the marketplace, in the real world setting. Is this in line with the approved indication, improved dosage, what co-medications are being used? And this will give you an idea then of where perhaps your risk areas are. And then, as we said before, a measure of the effectiveness of a risk minimization activity. So moving on, and I think this is really important because Module 8 is really focusing on the non-interventional post-authorization safety studies. And the best way to think about the studies is that you can either have an obligated study or a voluntary study. So obligated study is where the health authority has said to you, you have to perform this study, and it becomes part of your marketing authorization. It's a commitment, basically. Voluntary is where you as a company have decided that you need to look at something further and you're going to perform a study. It's not mandated. And then you need to look at interventional study or non-interventional study, and there's been a lot of debate about what is interventional, what's non-interventional. The reason that you need to look at whether it's interventional or not is because if it's interventional, it wouldn't be covered by this guideline. You would then need to look at the Clinical Trial Directive 2001/20/EC and follow the recommendations or the requirements of that. And I think previously, whenever anyone would talk about a post-authorization safety study, they'd think that it was non-interventional just by the name that you called it a PAS. But that's not necessarily true. And you can have an interventional safety study, post-authorization safety study. I've listed here what makes a study non-interventional. This is from Module 8. And basically you're meant to be using the product in line with the marketing authorization. You're not assigning a patient to any specific treatment. That you're not deciding in advance what treatment that patient should receive. They come to see you and you would treat them as you would as per normal practice. And I know that when we first had the definition of non-interventional, there was a lot of discussion about whether if you do additional blood samples, if you do an interview, is this considered non-interventional or not? And they have tried to provide a little bit more guidance with regards to this in Module 8. So here you can see, if you look at primary data collection, they talk about the prospective observational studies, registries, etc. And they do say, though, data collected from routine clinical care, such as interviews, questionnaires, and blood samples, that would normally be performed as per routine clinical practice for this patient, that would be a non-interventional study, not an interventional study. Then you also have your secondary data collection. So this is where you're looking at databases which have records from GPs, from hospitals, etc., from insurance claims, and you're looking for the event of interest, and that's more secondary data. That's a non-interventional study in itself. So moving on, as we talked a little bit about the obligated studies and the voluntary studies, so in Module 5 they have listed the different types of post-authorization safety studies to help complete the risk management plan, which is really what Module 5. So here they've got 4 different categories. Category 1 is imposed as an obligation by the health authority. Category 2, imposed as a specific obligation, but in the framework of marketing authorization granted under exceptional circumstances. A Category 3, where this is not imposed, but there is an obligation because you need to perform this study to look at either a specific safety concern or to evaluate the effectiveness of your risk minimization activity. And then a Category 4 is a much lower level kind of, they may provide some safety information, but it's not as significant as the other studies. And this just shows you the table from GVP Module 5, and I know it's a bit hard to see, but if you go into Module 5, you'll be able to see this table. It's got the 4 different categories. You can see that kind of in the middle, 1 to 4, interventional, non-interventional, and kind of gives you the status with regards to whether it's mandatory and subject to penalties, so that's 1 and 2, or whether it's legally enforceable, which is Category 3. And I think it's just there really to help you understand what legislative area it's covered under, because you can see the reference there, and also where you put it within the risk management plan. So talking a bit more about the obligated studies, and certainly the implementing regulation and the legislation itself focuses very heavily on this and what you need to do in this setting. So you can have an obligated study at application, when you submit an application, or if there's an emerging safety issue that's associated with your product. And they can actually ask for joint studies as well if you've got more than one marketing authorization holder. So what normally happens is that there's a review, there's a decision that you need to actually perform a post-authorization safety study, and that would be supervised and assessed by the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee. So you would need to submit the protocol, final study report, etc. There's certain obligations with regards to what you need to do. Your protocol, final study report, draft protocol would need to be submitted basically to PRAC. If you've got a study that's only going to be carried out in one country, then you would submit that to the National Competent Authority of that country only. If it's a central authorized product, you would then submit to EMA as well. You would then get endorsement by PRAC, and they will issue you a letter either endorsing or objecting to the protocol that you've submitted, either because it's out of scope. So they may say, actually, this is an interventional study. You need to you need to ensure that this is carried out under the clinical trial directive, it's not under our remit, or they may say, actually, we don't quite agree with how you've put the study together, and they will suggest amendments. Now, when you are, just before you submit the protocol, you can actually submit queries, and there is an email that I've listed here where you can submit queries specifically for obligated studies. If you go onto the EMA website, they do have a section with questions and answers for post-authorization safety studies, which has a lot of detail in there and kind of points you in the right direction with regards to who you could contact if you do have queries. I think importantly, one thing that I should have put on the slide, which I haven't, is that you will get a request that you need to perform an obligated post-authorization safety study, and as marketing authorization holder, you have 30 days to respond to that and to say, yes, you agree, or no, you don't agree, and state the reasons why you don't agree. And then you will get a response back that tells you yes or no, okay, fine, we agree that you don't need to do a study, or no, you do need to do a study. So looking at the timetable now, the time frame. So the evaluation of the protocol when you submit that is 60 days, a 60-day procedure. And as we've talked about, the outcomes are you're saying that it's under the clinical trial directive, a letter of objection, and then you will then be required to send in an amended protocol, a letter of endorsement, and it could be that they have some minor amendments that they recommend which you can implement, but you would not need to resubmit. But if there's a substantial amendment, then that would be listed in section 5 of their response to you. So there are other obligations as well with regards to study documentation. So you do, at the study end, need to send in your study report within 12 months of the end of data collection, and that needs to go to PRAC unless you have a waiver in place, because you know there's going to be some difficulty in getting that report out. And PRAC will then assess and make recommendations and state what the reasons are for those recommendations. And you can either have a maintenance of your marketing authorization, and that will be the final step, or you could have a recommendation for variation of your license, which will then be forwarded to the CHMP, and then the CHMP will adopt the opinion and forward to European Commission. There's no timetable as yet for this process as a whole, and I'm not sure how many companies have had experience with this. I haven't seen any data as yet. Another thing is that you need to understand that when you've got a final manuscript as well and it's been accepted for publishing, you need to send it to the national competent authorities and to the EMA within 2 weeks of acceptance, and that's really so that everybody can understand fully exactly what is going to be out in the public domain. So there is a pilot as well for scientific advice for safety studies, and this is a 12-month pilot, and it's run by the Scientific Advice Working Party, which PRAC endorses the advice that comes out from there, and it's really meant to be for Category 3 studies, so those studies that are important but not obligated, they're not mandatory. There are a lot of checklists and guidances that are around, so we have the NCEP checklist for study protocols, and if you go onto the EMA website, you will see that there is a whole dedicated section to NCEP, which is looking at pharmacoepidemiology and pharmacovigilance and really providing good practice documents around that, helping you to write a protocol, and it's a very good resource for anyone that's trying to write a post-authorization safety study. There's also the guideline for pediatric populations and also for epidemiology coming from ISOP as well. So these are all good resources to use. So I did want to touch a little bit on terminology. So within Module 8, we have definitions for dates your study commences, end of data collection, substantial amendments, and these are all important that drive what needs to be submitted to the health authority at what time. So data start of data collection is when information on your first study subject is recorded in the study data set. And it doesn't include simple count in a database to support study protocols. So maybe you're just doing some simple count to work out exactly whether you can use a certain database or not. That's not a data start of the study. The end of data collection is when you have a data set that's completely available where you can actually perform your analyses for your primary objective of that study. Substantial amendments are those that are likely to have impact on patient safety or the physical well-being of the study participants, or anything that might affect the study results. So that would be things like changes to the objectives, population, sample size, etc. And those are important because there are obligations around that when it comes to certainly your obligated studies. So looking a bit now at when you're starting off and looking at a post-authorization safety study, the NCEP Code of Conduct provides a framework really and points to consider when you are looking at what you need to do. So really you need to ensure that you have a rationale, main objective for the methods of research. You need to ensure that the rights and obligations of both the investigator and the marketing authorization holder are considered with clear assignment of tasks and responsibilities so everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing. There needs to be a procedure for getting agreement on the study protocol, a review of some kind to ensure that everybody agrees with what's going to be suggested or what's going to be put into place. And then you need to ensure that the PV obligations can be met as well. Need to consider how intellectual property rights will be dealt with, and then look at how the data will be stored and analysed, and the ability to come back and have access to that in an audit or inspection setting. Communication strategy as well needs to be considered, and that's for your progress and final reports, and then publication strategy and who's going to be overseeing that for your interim and your final results. And make sure that there is agreement through with your principal investigator and the marketing authorization holder. So looking at study registration now, so once you have decided you're going to start your study, you will need to register your study, and this needs to go onto the EU PASS register, which is really, it's mediated through NCEP. And there is a requirement for or studies outside of the EU to be registered on there as well. And this is accessible through the web portal. Again, if you go onto the NCEP website on the EMA, it will say, what do you want to do? Do you want to register a study? You can click on it and you can go in and register your study. You need to register before you start a data collection, and you need to add substantial amendments and progress reports and the final study report 2 weeks after finalisation. Normally they would expect the report or whatever's included onto the register to be in English or a translation of the title, abstract of the study protocol, abstract of the final study report. If you do have sensitive data, then you can redact some of the information and put that on there. But this is all towards transparency and making sure that there's an awareness of what's going on in your product, what issues are coming up, and it's not just limited to the company and the company knowing. So when writing your protocol and deciding how to put that together in the review process, we've already talked about the review and the fact that it does need to go to PRAC or National Competent Authority, depending on how many countries you're running that study in. But really what you need to look at is Addendum 1 of Module 8. Before, this used to be part of Module 8, but now they've taken that out, and it is a separate addendum. And this shows you what your obligations are with regards to submitting to the health authorities in different countries when you have an obligated or a voluntary study. If you have a centrally authorized product, you need to transmit that to the agency. When you're putting a protocol together, it's important that you can show that the QPPV or delegate has reviewed and signed off for the EU studies. And you mustn't forget your PV people at the national level as well, and ensure that they're informed of the study and they also have access to the protocol so that they know what's going on as well. Putting the protocol together, I haven't covered here, but if you go to Module 8, very clear guidance with regards to what should be considered and how to put that protocol together. So just wanted to show you here in Module 8, this is the addendum, and again it is a little bit small, but this is what you need to refer to when you're starting your study and working out what needs to be submitted where. So this is studies imposed as an obligation. And you can see that you're going to have to transmit information with regards to the protocol, substantial amendments, final study report directly to the member states for any country where the study is being conducted. You also need to submit to where the member states are acting as a rapporteur or reference RMS for the medicinal product, a reference member state for the medicinal product, and also in certain countries, progress reports would be required. I think Germany, if you have the product on the marketplace, even if you're not doing the study. So you need to keep referring this because it's updated on a regular basis depending on what changes. This is for obligated studies. It's a bit different for your mandatory studies, and it really does depend on which country you're conducting the study or where you have your product authorized, and you would refer to the second table, which shows you what you need to do. And you can see it's slightly different. Here, transmission by marketing authorization holder, but through notification of the EU PAS register, so they can get that information from the PAS register for certain countries where the study is conducted, but other countries want additional transmission directly to the National Competent Authority, and you can see they are here. Okay, so you would need to look through this and make sure that you have understood what your obligations are at that time. So moving on, looking at the different types of studies. So first of all, you can have active surveillance, and this, in contrast to passive surveillance, tries to get a bit more information with regards to either a specific population or a specific event. And this could be follow-up of patients treated with a particular product who are then asked, to provide additional information. Or it could even be things like automatic detection of certain lab values. So intensive monitoring is where you go into either hospitals or specific healthcare professionals and you collect further information through looking through data, review of medical records, or use the Sentinel sites. The only issue here is that it is quite resource intensive. You do need a trained monitoring team that will be able to go out and do that. You also have your prescription event monitoring, and here you can identify patients from your electronic prescription data or your health insurance claims, and then you can send a request for information with regards to follow-up at regular intervals in that patient cohort and collect data to review. And then we have your registries, which are organized data collection using observational methods. Usually it's either disease-based or exposure-based, so it could be, for example, you've got databases for severe skin reactions. Also, you've got pregnancy registries, or you could have anti-epileptics. You've got a registry for patients that are on anti-epileptics. And the idea is that you collect information on an ongoing basis, and then you can review that data in that subset of population. It's not good. The only issue with the registries is that there isn't a comparison group, but it's useful to amplify signals and for rare outcomes as well. So often, if you have a rare outcome, or if you have quite a significant product, you'd probably be asked to set up a registry with regards to that. So looking at observational studies, so these are kind of your classic epidemiological type studies, your cross-sectional study, which is a survey, single point in time, can give you some information on incidents, can be used if you repeat the study on a regular basis. You can then get some information on trends. Cohort studies, it's closest probably to a randomized controlled trial, but it takes a long time because you get your patients with your exposure of interest and you compare it to that with no exposure. And you can then make some causal inference from these studies, but they do take a long time and they're not good for rare outcomes. Case control study, this is more looking retrospectively. You've got your patient with the outcome and you compare with no outcome, and then you look to see what the differences are between those two groups, but you can't make any causal inference because you started off with the outcome in that patient population. But it's good for looking at possible risk factors and what further studies would be needed from a causality perspective. You can see where perhaps there might be an increase in a certain exposure, and you could then go on and do another study thereafter. Okay, then you have your large, simple trials. So these are clinical trials, and they say large, simple, but they're not usually that simple. Simple just refers to the data structure, not the collection, and you just have very kind of top-line monitoring in these studies. Usually a small number of outcomes are measured, still very complex to run. And then a drug utilization study. How is your drug used at the base level, real-world data, kind of what's actually happening in the marketplace, and is this what you would expect with regards to your indications, your label, etc. And you can also use this to see if you have changed your label, whether there has been any change then in the utilization of your product. Okay, just to touch on adverse event reporting, so it's divided up. Most of this comes from Module 6. It's divided up into primary data collection and secondary data. So if it's primary data collection, so you've got your cohort study, something like that, you need to collect all of your ads, or if you don't, you need to justify why certain events aren't collected, and that needs to be in the protocol. And you need to expedite according to the post-marketing reporting, so according to GVP Module 6. Fatal outcomes should be collected unless there are reasons not to. So this is a bit like in the clinical trial setting where if there's a patient population with a high mortality, or if it is part of your endpoint, then you may not want to collect that, and you can detail that in the protocol. You need to summarize all of your events as part of the interim or final study report, and a healthcare professional needs to be aware of what the reporting requirements are, and this needs to be through the protocol and then would obviously be through training on the study. For secondary use of data, though, you don't need to expedite at all. It is really, you need to summarize in the interim and in the final study report. So the last 3 slides are just a bit on quality management considerations and KPIs, that kind of thing, because we've covered a lot. I think the important thing is these are the things that you need to consider when you're looking at the processes that you have within your organisation. So first of all, QPPV involvement. They need to be involved in the review and sign off. They have to sign off on any EU post-authorization safety studies. You need to have a process that ensures that you can respond for obligated studies within that 30-day time frame. You need to be able to track your obligated studies as well and track that obligation because it is a regulatory obligation. Registration, so as we looked at, you know that you have to register your study, you have to add information on updates, interim reports, on final study report needs to be uploaded as well, so you need a process that covers that. Your protocol needs to be approved before study start, obligated, but also for non-obligated in a lot of countries as well. And you need to ensure that you have a process that covers substantial amendment, definition and approval for your protocol as well. Your final study report needs to be sent to PRAC within 12 months after the end of study, and that needs to be detailed as well. And you need to be able to track that and make sure you don't miss your deadlines on that. And you need to notify the National Competent Authority after your publication has been accepted. Throughout all of this, throughout all of your studies, you need to monitor your product benefit risk and whether any changes are required on an ongoing basis. So again, you need to ensure that whatever you have in place is relevant to the product, the type of event that you're looking at, and you can show that you have monitored that benefit risk basis throughout the study. Your reporting requirements, make sure that you know exactly what study it is. Is it a clinical trial directive study under 2001-20 interventional, or is it one that you need to use with post-marketing guidance for or reporting requirements for? Capturing of your serious, non-serious adverse events and making sure that they're reported. Remember, there are some countries where non-serious adverse events may be required, in which case you would need to send these through from these studies. And making sure you link to your other documents, such as your PBRA, RMP, DSUR, so that at each stage, where relevant, the right information does go into those documents. So I think looking at metrics and KPIs, it's a bit difficult. I think people are still struggling a bit as well with regards to this, but there's ones like time frame for protocol submission and having a standard time frame for that, making sure you meet your 12-month or your final study report submission, make sure all of your studies are registered, One, I guess, KPI would be comments or changes back from your regulatory authority, because the better the protocol, the better thought behind that. You shouldn't be getting so many comments back, and making sure your QPPV signs off for all protocols related to post-authorization safety studies. My last slide is just on inspections, areas to consider. It's a bit like the quality management side. Make sure you know what study you've got, whether it's interventional or not, and whether you are reporting according to the right regulation. That's absolutely key. Making sure that you are receiving, recording, and assessing those cases appropriately. Those cases will be considered solicited cases, and they will need to have causality assessment performed, and that needs to be documented. Make sure that your study results are going into your relevant documents, you're using the appropriate reference safety information, and that if there are changes that with regards to information that comes from the study, that everything is updated appropriately, so your scientific information is kept up to date. And your safety data is included in ongoing safety evaluations, so your signals, etc., and is reviewed on a regular basis. So we're just out of time by 2 minutes. I'm going to stop there. I know that was a very quick run through post-authorization safety studies. Are there any questions? Okay, I can see somebody typing now. If the product is carried out, if PAS is carried out on a product used in surgical procedure setting, will study design be categorized as interventional or non-interventional? So if it's a surgical procedure, if it would have been used in that setting anyway, there's no change to clinical care, there's no pre-decision as to what treatment that patient is going to receive based on a protocol of some kind, that would be non-interventional. So I don't think it's the setting, it's more the decisions that are made beforehand that would dictate whether that's a post-authorization safety study or not. And the safety bit is important because, again, I would assume that there's a safety element there where the focus is on safety rather than an efficacy study. I hope did that answer your question? I think you're just typing. See what comes up first. Sorry about the pause. We're just waiting for the typing to come up. No, it doesn't. I think for some reason it's not coming up. I mean, Sebastian, if I haven't answered your question, maybe you can drop me an email if you want, or give me a call and we can go through that. All right, so Rosie said, does the MAH have a choice on the type of PAS? Yeah, so basically when you are obligated to perform a study, they will just give you the area that you're meant to look at or what the issue is, and then you would then decide what's the best way of assessing that issue, and that's where your protocol development would come into play, and then you would send the protocol off, draft protocol off for approval. Thanks. Okay, are there any other questions? So Vignesh says, does PAS that are exclusively requested by regulatory authorities? No. Okay, so are they listed, are the main source of new safety information listed in the SPC within the post-marketing setting? Just so I've understood that correctly, are you talking about the PAS itself or the results of the PAS? So what would happen is that you would have your post-authorization safety study. I'll wait till you clarify. Results of the PAS. Okay, it depends really on what the results are, because the results could be that nothing further needs to be done, in which case you wouldn't update your SPC. But if the results show that you do need, there is some evidence there and it does impact on your product profile, then you would need to update the SPC through. And it would go, and again, I think it depends on exactly what your post-authorization safety study is looking at as to where it would go. Because if it's looking at a specific event and characterizing it, maybe that event is discussed in the warnings and precautions, and it may be that it adds further characterization to risk that's in your warnings and precautions for it. So it really does depend on what it is that you're looking at as to which part of the SPC would be updated. No problem. Are there any other questions? Okay, I think the typing's on a bit quiet, so if you do have any, and I'll pass you back to Michelle.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time today, everyone. I'm going to be stopping the recording in a second, and I will be firing it through to everyone afterwards. There'll be an email address on there as well if you do have anything further that you'd like to request information on. But thank you very much for your time today.